The argument I make in the book is essentially that not that deception is just something that leaders occasionally do that poses a problem for these big arguments about democracy and war, but that it's actually a natural outgrowth of the democratic process. That the very institutional constraints that the scholarly wisdom has emphasized encourage leaders to mislead the public on these big decisions. And this is basically because elected leaders have good reasons to maximize domestic support for war. War is a costly, high-stakes endeavor. It can redound to the disadvantage of leaders who get the country into losing or misguided wars. And so leaders want to go into a war with as much domestic support as possible. This is actually all highlighted by the prevailing scholarly wisdom. Where I think the wisdom goes wrong is in missing the tools that leaders have at their disposal to kind of rig the process. And basically the ones I emphasize are the ability of leaders to exploit information and propaganda advantages to frame issues in misleading ways, to cherry pick supporting evidence, to suppress damaging revelations and otherwise skew the public debate. And in particular, I talk about kind of two big kinds of deception in the book that are encouraged by two different scenarios. So the first scenario is a case where a leader, for strategic reasons, feels war is necessary, but this war promises to be costly, victory is uncertain, it promises to be very contentious domestically. And here is where I argue leaders are going to resort to what I call blame shifting. And blame shifting is basically a set of tactics that's meant to shift blame for war onto the adversary, to basically say that it's not our side that wants war, the other side made us do it. And so this is going to entail basically obscuring or concealing your own interest in war and looking for pretexts that kind of shift blame to the other side. The second type of deception that I talk about in the book you're going to find more in environments where the domestic politics are less contentious. War is seen as cheap, quick victory is likely, victory more assured. And so leaders are going to not be dealing with much in the way of active, organized opposition to war, but more kind of a latent uneasiness that, hey, maybe this isn't necessary. If war is going to be so quick and easy, why are we fighting in the first place? And hence, what you need to do if you're a shrewd leader is to oversell. That is, to exaggerate the threat that you're dealing with, to make war look necessary. And the key part here is that you can kind of, if you're a leader, threat inflate away because the political opposition, those that would normally be calling you out for your misleading claims, are not going to have much of a political incentive to do that. Their instinct is going to be to let's change the subject, get the quick and decisive victory over with, and get onto firmer terrain for us politically. And so really what leaders are taking advantage of is the fact that there might be a little bit of latent unease, but not much in the way of active opposition, and they just kind of need to push the boulder a bit further up the hill. Okay, so those are the two big kinds of deception that I talk about in the book. How does this map onto the cases I look at? I look at three cases in an in-depth way. I ask a few questions of each case. When and why did leaders settle on war? How much domestic opposition did they anticipate? Did they resort to deception in response? And what forms did that deception take? And what were the effects? And I look at three cases: World War II, which I argue is primarily a case of blame shifting; the Vietnam War, which I also argue is a case of blame shifting, although less severe than in the World War II case; and then finally the Iraq War case, which I argue is a case of overselling. If you want to put it in more quantitative terms, I code World War II as a, quote, high opposition, high deception case. The Vietnam War is a medium opposition, medium deception case, and the Iraq War is a low opposition, low deception case. And I don't have time, nearly enough time, to go into all the details here in the three cases. I will say the World War II case is the most controversial. Historians have generally been divided on the question of whether Roosevelt really did seek war prior to Pearl Harbor, with more historians than not coming down on the argument that he wasn't, even if he was knowingly risking war to kind of keep the other allies, Britain and the Soviet Union, in the fight. I argue that that this is probably being a bit too charitable to Roosevelt, that by the summer and certainly the fall of 1941, he was, I would argue, resigned to the U.S. getting into the war and was willing to do very little to stop the U.S. getting into it, and in fact was pursuing policies in the Atlantic and the Pacific that he knew would probably lead to war. And at that point, I think he thought the time was right, because the U.S. really needed to get in before the Soviet Union succumbed to the Nazis, in which case Nazi Germany would be in a very strong position in Eurasia, and the U.S. would have a very tough time kind of fighting their way onto the continent. This is, if you will, a more, I guess, a modern version of the backdoor to war argument, that Roosevelt took advantage of the Pacific situation with Japan to bring the U.S. into the war in Europe against Germany, although shorn of kind of the older conspiracy theories that FDR knew Pearl Harbor was coming and let it happen. This is more an argument that FDR was knowingly putting intense pressure on Japan at a time when others were telling him, you probably shouldn't do that if you want to avoid war here. And he did so because he was resigned, again, to the fact, I use that word resigned carefully, that the U.S. would eventually enter the war against the Axis as a whole, and this was one way to get in while preserving domestic unity. And I can get into more on that case in the Q&A if you'd like. The Vietnam War, I describe as a more creeping form of blame shifting, where FDR is not dealing with the intense opposition that FDR did in 1940, 1941. I would describe it as more just a general lack of enthusiasm about fighting a land war in Asia without much in the way of people in the streets protesting about it yet. And so LBJ's instinct was to simply squash or minimize debate on the subject by basically downplaying any escalatory moves the U.S. was taking and explaining those that the U.S. did take by pointing to Viet Cong or communist provocations. And before you know it, the U.S. is in a fairly major land war in Asia, and really there wasn't much discussion in public of how we got there. Finally, the Iraq War, again, overselling. What I primarily discuss in that case is the Bush administration's rhetorical treatment of the Iraq threat, and the fact that they were able to say a lot of things about the immediacy and the severity of the Iraq threat that didn't accord very well with the facts, primarily because the Democrats just didn't have much political interest in making an issue out of it. And I think for many in the Bush administration, the thinking was, we have a solid preventive case for war. That is, Iraq's a long-term threat. That's why we should do it. But they felt they needed to embellish a bit to say, not only is this a long-term threat, it's a more immediate one. That's where they start to get into factual trouble and the deception comes into play. And there's really just not enough people calling them on some of the specifics, uranium in Africa, et cetera, until the war goes badly, and then all of a sudden there's a lot of interest in the origins. Okay, what are the implications of this line of work? I think there are three that are of interest. The first is that I would not argue that the domestic political constraints that Democratic leaders face are weak or inoperative, as some of my realist colleagues have. I would argue that they're quite real, but that they can be overcome through tactics like deception. The second point I would make is that, again, the marketplace of ideas, which has also been poo-pooed strongly by many realist colleagues, it is real. Democratic leaders do have to make arguments in public and defend them. They have to give reasons for going to war. The problem is that the marketplace of ideas is not strong enough to serve as a deterrent to deception. There are too many mixed incentives and too many ways that those with the information can spin it or conceal it to mislead the audience. The final point I would make is that, and this is where this gets into big old debates about kind of, whether whether democracy and public opinion are a good thing for foreign policy. What are the effects of deception? Can it be justified? Many liberals argue that deception is pretty much never a good idea. Realists, certainly classical realists like Hans Morgenthau, thought that the key ingredient of leadership was deceiving the public because the public was a bunch of bumpkins. But my view is it's more conditional, that it really depends on whether war is justified in a particular case. I know that's a bit weaselly, but I really can't find any general satisfying take on this. But I don't think it's uniformly a bad thing. I think World War II, FDR has deserved a lot of the praise he's gotten for his devious tactics in the run-up to the war. I think, history looks less kindly on the other presidents that I've covered.